Daughter-in-law excused herself from the table to take a call outside, and that's when the man in the grey cardigan leaned over from the next booth and slid a folded piece of paper under my coffee cup. He was maybe 75, white hair, hands that shook slightly, but his eyes were steady and serious. He said quietly enough that only I could hear, "Don't sign anything tonight, James. Read that first." Then he picked up his hat, left a 20 on the table, and walked out before I could say a word. I sat there with the paper burning under my cup like a coal. My daughter-in-law came back 2 minutes later, smiling, apologetic, something about her sister and a scheduling mix-up. She slid back into the booth across from me and reached for her tea, and I remember thinking, she doesn't know. Whatever this is, she doesn't know yet that anything has changed. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Sudbury, Ontario. I coached junior hockey for 12 of those years. I am not a man who panics easily or imagines things that aren't there. So when I say that something about that folded piece of paper made my hands go cold before I even opened it, I want you to understand that it wasn't nothing. It was the kind of dread that comes from somewhere deep and honest in a person, the kind your body knows before your mind catches up. My wife Helen died 14 months before any of this happened, pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which the doctors called mercifully fast and which I called the cruelest thing I'd ever witnessed. We were married 41 years. She was the one who kept the files organized, who remembered the account numbers, who knew where the insurance policies were. I am a man who taught the Battle of Vimy Ridge to 16-year-olds and could name every Canadian Prime Minister in order. I could not have told you the name of our financial institution without looking it up after Helen passed. My son Michael lives in Calgary. He's an engineer, good man, busy. He flew out for the funeral and stayed 2 weeks and called every Sunday after. His wife Carla, that's my daughter-in-law, she was the one who kept offering to help. She'd come from Sudbury originally, knew the city, knew some people. After Helen died, she started driving up from Toronto every couple of weeks to check on me. At first I was grateful. A 67-year-old widower who burns his toast and forgets to eat lunch is not a man who should be turning away kindness. She helped me go through Helen's papers. She helped me consolidate the accounts. She introduced me to a financial advisor named Stuart Holt, who had a warm handshake and an office on Elm Street, and who sat across from me with a binder full of options and told me that at my age, with my assets, I should be thinking about simplifying, making things easier for the people who would eventually need to manage things. I didn't think much about that word. Eventually. The dinner that night was at a place called the Field House, a family restaurant off Notre Dame Avenue that Helen and I had gone to for years. Carla had suggested it. She'd been up for the weekend, helping me sort through some paperwork, and she made a reservation and said we should have a proper sit-down meal instead of whatever I was cobbling together at home. My son had called that morning from Calgary and said he was glad she was looking out for me. He said I should listen to her about the estate planning stuff. He trusted her completely. I trusted her too. That's the part I keep coming back to. When the man in the grey cardigan walks out and left me alone with that folded paper, I waited until Carla went up to the front to ask about dessert options. Then I opened it. It was a photocopy of a document, a trust agreement. My name was on it, my address, my SIN number. Beside it, printed neat and small, a list of assets being transferred into the trust. My house on Elm Crescent. My RRSPs. The GIC Helen and I had held since 1998. The beneficiary of the trust was listed as something called Hearthside Family Planning Group. I'd never heard of Hearthside Family Planning Group. At the bottom of the page, in pen, someone had written, "Check who owns it. Check Stuart Holt's license. The signature on page 4 is not yours." I folded it back up and put it in my jacket pocket. By the time Carla came back to the table, I had rearranged my face into something that looked like a tired old man thinking about nothing in particular. It was the hardest acting I've ever done. She brought the dessert menu. She slid it across with a smile and said, "They still have the butter tart. I know that was Helen's favorite." It was, and she knew it was, and I used to find that kind of thoughtfulness touching. I ordered the butter tart and ate it and said very little, and drove home alone and sat in my kitchen until midnight, reading the document over and over until I understood what I was looking at. The signature on page 4 was not my handwriting. It was close. Someone had studied mine carefully, but the loop on the J in James was wrong, and the way I cross a capital H is something Helen teased me about for years. A flat cross, she called it, a dead bird, and the signature on that page had a slight upward curve. Whoever forged it was good, but they didn't know about the dead bird. I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair Helen used to read in, and I thought about the last 6 months. The accounts consolidated, the will adjustment Carla had suggested, just to make things cleaner, she'd said, the power of attorney paperwork that Stuart Holt had drawn up for my signature. I'd signed it. I remembered signing it. Carla had been there. She'd made tea. By 3 in the morning, I understood that the house I was sitting in might already be in the process of being taken from me. I went back to the field house the next morning. Saturday. It opened at 7 for breakfast. I sat in the same booth and ordered coffee and waited, not knowing if I was being a fool or the opposite. He came in at 1:15, the man in the grey cardigan. He was carrying a manila envelope, and he slid into the booth across from me without asking and said, "I wasn't sure you'd come back." His name was Walter Drummond. He was 76, retired from the Ontario Provincial Police, and his wife had died at Sunnybrook in Toronto 2 years ago. He said, her name then was Carla Marsh. Before that, she was using Carla Webb. She cycles through surnames. She keeps the first name. Makes it easier, I think. Less to remember. I stared at him. She found me through a seniors investment seminar in Bari. I was 8 months out from my wife's death. She was working with a man named Holt at the time. Same man. Different city. They moved their operation to Sudbury 18 months ago. He opened his envelope and laid documents on the table between us. I almost lost my house. My daughter caught it in time. By then they'd already taken $60,000 from my RRSP. I looked at the documents. The trust agreement structure was identical to the one in my pocket. Different names, same language, same layout. How many? I asked. He said, that I know of. 7. All widowers, all over 65. All with assets, and no one close by watching. She takes her time. 6 months, sometimes a year. She's patient. The financial advisor gives the operation credibility. She provides the emotional access. He paused. You liked her. It wasn't a question. It stung anyway. My son trusts her, I said. They're married. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. I know, that's why this one is more complicated. I ordered more coffee. I needed something to do with my hands. He explained the structure. Hearthside Family Planning Group was a numbered company registered in Ontario. Stuart Holt was the director of record. The trust agreement signed over assets to the company under the pretense of estate planning. Once the assets were in the trust, they were moved through a series of transfers. By the time anyone started asking questions, the money was gone, and the document showed the victim had consented to everything. The power of attorney was the last piece. Once that was registered with the province, Holt could act on my behalf. He could sell my house. He could close my accounts. And if I objected, Carla could suggest that my grief had affected my judgment. That I'd become confused. That I needed help. There was no psychiatric element in their playbook, Walter told me. They didn't go that far. What they did instead was simpler and, in some ways, worse. They used the bureaucracy of grief, the avalanche of forms a person faces when their spouse dies, the disorientation of suddenly being responsible for everything alone. They moved in exactly when a person is most overwhelmed and most grateful for someone who seems to understand. Why haven't the police done anything? I asked. He said, the documents look legitimate. Holt is a licensed financial advisor, or was, until 3 weeks ago when the Ontario Securities Commission suspended his registration. But that's new. The civil cases from my situation and 2 others are still moving through. They need more. He looked at me directly. They need an active case, someone who can document what's happening in real time, before the transfer's complete. I thought about Michael in Cowdrey. I thought about calling him and telling him that his wife had been slowly stealing from his father while pretending to grieve alongside us. I thought about what that information would do to him. I thought about the 6 other men Walter had mentioned. "What do you need from me?" I said. He slid a business card across the table. Ontario Securities Commission, with a name and a direct number. Then a second card, a detective with the OPP Financial Crimes Unit in Sudbury. They've been building this case. They need the trust documents, the power of attorney agreement, and evidence of the forged signature. If you can get access to Holt's records, anything showing the asset transfers, that closes the loop. And how do I do that without Carla knowing? She's coming back next weekend. Sunday, I said. She's bringing paperwork for me to sign. Walter nodded slowly. Then you have a week. I drove home and sat in my kitchen again, but this time I was thinking clearly. 68 years old, retired teacher. Not a spy, not a lawyer, not particularly tech-savvy, but I'd spent 31 years managing a classroom of teenagers who thought they could get away with things, and I learned something useful in those years. People who believe they have the upper hand stop being careful. I called the OSC contact that afternoon, a woman named Investigator Chen, and she was direct, professional, asked me to email photographs of the documents I had, and told me not to sign anything else. She confirmed that Holt's license had been suspended, and that there was an active investigation. She said she needed the original trust document if one existed, and any electronic records I could access showing transactions. She also said, carefully, that she understood my family situation was complicated, and that any information I provided would be handled with discretion. She didn't promise me my son's marriage would survive this. Nobody could promise that. That week was the longest of my life. I called Michael on Sunday, normal time, said nothing. Listened to him talk about a project he was working on, a new neighborhood in the northeast part of the city. He sounded happy. He sounded like himself. I said I was fine and that Carla had been a great help, and that I was grateful. Every word felt like swallowing gravel. On Tuesday, I called my own lawyer, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had handled Helen's estate and who had never been involved with Stuart Holt. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "James, if that signature is forged, the trust agreement is void. The power of attorney may also be challengeable if it was executed improperly." She said she would make some calls. On Thursday, I went to Holt's office on Elm Street. I told the receptionist I had questions about my estate plan and would like to see him. He came out smiling, that warm handshake, the binder. I sat across from him, and I said I'd been reviewing the documents and had some concerns about the Hearthside trust structure. And I watched his face while I said it. He was good, barely a flicker. He said it was a standard arrangement. Very common for estates at my level. Everything was above board, I shouldn't worry. But he reached for his phone while he was talking, and he turned it face down, and his left hand gripped the arm of his chair. I said, I'd like copies of all the documents I've signed, for my own records. He said he could have them ready next week. I said I'd like them before Sunday, if possible. He said he'd see what he could do. I left and called Investigator Chen from my car. She said that the meeting itself was useful. It put Holt on notice that something had shifted, and that might cause them to accelerate or make mistakes. She asked me to stay calm and act as normally as possible with Carla on Sunday. She also told me, quietly, that the OPP had been granted a warrant to examine Holt's financial records. Carla arrived Sunday afternoon. She'd driven up from Toronto, brought a casserole, set it on my counter, and looked around my kitchen with that familiar expression, warm, slightly concerned, like a woman who loved someone and was worried about him. For 14 months, I had read that expression as kindness. Standing there watching her put her coat on the hook by the door, I understood that I would never be fully sure what was real and what wasn't, and that uncertainty would be with me for a long time. She brought a folder. New documents, she said. Just some updates to the trust, clarifying language. Holt had recommended them. I sat down at the kitchen table and I opened the folder. I read through the documents carefully, which I had not always done before. She sat across from me, tea in hand, patient. I said, I notice my signature looks a bit different on some of these earlier pages. She said, you signed them yourself, James. You didn't remember. You were pretty tired that day. You'd had a hard week. I looked at her. Which day was that exactly? A pause. Brief. The Tuesday, I think, when we went through the RRSP documents. I was in Sudbury that Tuesday at a school reunion. I have photographs. The temperature in my kitchen changed. She said, maybe it was Wednesday. I might be misremembering. I said, Carla, I'd like you to know that I've spoken with a lawyer and with the OSC and with an OPP investigator. I'd also like you to know that Stuart Holt's license was suspended 3 weeks ago, which I expect you already know. She was very still. I said, and I'd like you to know that whatever happens next, whatever this means for you and Michael, I want you to hear it from me directly. I'm not angry. I'm heartbroken. There's a difference. She stood up. She reached for her phone. She said, in a voice I hadn't heard from her before, flat, measured, James, you don't understand what you're doing. I said, I think I do. She left without her casserole. She drove back to Toronto. 12 minutes after she pulled out of my driveway, I received a call from a blocked number. No one spoke. It disconnected after 4 seconds. I called Investigator Chen. She said to stay at a neighbor's that night if I could. I called my neighbor Gord, a retired machinist who'd known Helen since we moved in, and he said, get in the car and come over, and he put the kettle on, and that was the end of the conversation. The OPP executed a search warrant at Holt's office on Monday morning. They found a digital ledger with 14 entries, 7 names I recognized from what Walter had told me. 7 more I didn't. All widowers, all Ontario, all over 65. The smallest amount taken was $42,000. The largest was $410,000. In total, across 8 years, the scheme had transferred just over $2 million in assets. My name was at the bottom of the list. The amount beside it read, in progress. Carla was arrested on Tuesday at the Toronto condo she and Michael shared. Holt was taken the same morning. Michael called me from Calgary at 6 in the evening. He'd been reached by Toronto police. His voice, when I picked up, sounded like a man standing on a floor that had just given way beneath him. I said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, son. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, did you know about her? I told him everything. The man in the grey cardigan, the diner, Walter Drummond, and what had happened to his family, the document with my forged signature, the week I'd spent trying not to let anything show. He was quiet again for so long I thought the cord had dropped. Then he said, you went to her office alone. To Holt's office. I did. Dad. Another long silence. Why didn't you call me? I thought about that. I thought about it all week. Because I didn't want to be wrong, I said, and because if I was right, I wanted to give you as much time as possible before it changed everything. He flew to Sudbury the following weekend. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd watched Carla lay out her folder of documents, and we drank coffee and talked for 4 hours. Some of it was about her. Most of it was about her. Most of it was about his mother, about the things we hadn't said clearly enough when we still had her with us, about the way grief makes you reach for whoever offers a steady hand, and how that's not weakness. That's just being human. The trial was 8 months later. I testified about the forged signature, the trust documents, the conversation in my kitchen. Walter Drummond testified about his experience and the pattern he'd identified. Investigator Chen presented the digital ledger and the financial records. Patricia Okafu provided expert testimony about the power of attorney's procedural irregularities. Carla's defense argued that I had signed the documents willingly and later fabricated the forgery claim out of grief-distorted confusion. My doctor testified that my cognitive function was assessed as fully intact. The jury had the documents. They had the ledger. They had the documents. They had the dead bird. Carla was convicted on 11 counts of fraud and breach of trust. Stuart Holt received a 12-year sentence. Carla received 9. The numbered company was dissolved. The assets that could be traced were frozen and returned through civil proceedings. 7 of the 14 victims recovered a portion of what was taken. Some recovered nearly everything. Some recovered almost nothing, because the transfers had been laundered through too many layers. I got my house back, my accounts, the GIC Helen and I had held since 1998. Michael filed for divorce from Toronto. He was back in Calgary by the time the trial ended, in a different apartment, working on a different project. He calls every Sunday still. Same time. We talk about hockey, about the weather, about whatever's in the news. Sometimes about his mother, slowly, the other things too. What he missed. What he should have noticed. Why he didn't. I tell him he trusted his wife. I tell him that's not a character flaw. That's what you're supposed to do. Walter and I have breakfast at the field house on the second Saturday of every month. We split the bill. He orders the same thing every time. Eggs over easy, white toast. Black coffee. I order the same thing every time, the oatmeal, because that's what Helen always said I should be eating, and I suppose some habits form late. We've been contacted by a seniors advocacy group in Ottawa who heard about the case through the OSC investigation. They asked if we'd be willing to speak at community centres, at libraries, at the kinds of places that host seminars about estate planning and investment options. We said yes. We've been to 6 cities now. Walter speaks first because he's older and has a policeman's way of making people pay attention. I speak second because I'm a teacher and I know how to end a lesson in a way that stays with you. What I tell people is this: grief is a door. It opens you in ways you don't anticipate. And there are people who watch for that opening, who have studied it, who know exactly when to offer a warm hand and a cup of tea and the promise that they'll handle the complicated parts. Those people are not helpers. They are waiting for you to trust them enough to stop looking. I also tell them about the dead bird, about the small particular thing only I knew about my own signature, about the way a person's life, 41 years of a life with someone, leaves traces in everything, even the way you hold a pen, that cannot be perfectly copied by someone who only knew you in your grief. Helen is the one who noticed it in the first place. She teased me about it for decades. That flat cross on the H, the dead bird, she said, laughing, every time she saw it. I never changed it. There was no reason to. There was one more reason, in the end. I was standing outside the courthouse in Sudbury on the last day of the trial, waiting for Michael's call, when Walter came and stood beside me. We didn't say much. We rarely do outside of the diner. After a while he said, "Frank would say, you handled yourself well." I said, "Who's Frank?" He looked at me sideways. "My brother. He died last year. Different situation, different province, but the same kind of people." He paused. He didn't get out in time. I didn't know what to say. I said I was sorry. He said, "Don't be sorry. Just keep showing up." So that's what I do. Every second Saturday at the field house. Every community centre in every city that asks. Every Sunday call with my son, who is slowly finding his way back to himself. Some doors, once they open, don't fully close again. The grief door, the betrayal door. They let in a draft that you feel for years, but I am 68 years old, and I taught history for 31 of them, and I know something about what people are capable of when they decide they are not finished yet. Helen would have found the right word for it. She always did. I just know how I feel when I sit in her chair at midnight with a cup of tea that's gone cold, thinking about that man in the grey cardigan and the folded piece of paper and the Tuesday I was in Sudbury with photographs to prove it. I feel like a man who still knows how to pay attention. And that, in the end, is everything. I think about the Tuesday I was in Sudbury with photographs to prove it, and I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't been there. If I'd been home that day quietly going through whatever it was Carla needed me to sign, I wouldn't have had an alibi written in someone else's camera roll. I wouldn't have noticed the dead bird missing from my own signature. The whole thing would have moved forward the way it was designed to, quietly, bureaucratically, invisibly. And by the time I understood what had happened, it would have been too late to undo. That's the part people don't want to sit with. The part where they almost got away with it, not because they were clever, but because I was grieving and tired and grateful for any hand that reached out. There's nothing shameful in that. Grief opens you. It's supposed to. The problem isn't that I trusted. It's that someone studied that trust and figured out exactly how to use it. What stopped them, in the end, wasn't luck. It was Walter Drummond, sitting in a booth at the field house with steady eyes and a manila envelope, and the moral clarity to act even when acting cost him something. He didn't have to get involved again. He'd already been through it once with his own family, already given his testimony, already done his part. He came back anyway because he knew what was coming for me, and he decided that knowing obligated him, That's a kind of decency I don't have a better word for. The kind that shows up not because it's easy or safe, but because it's right. And then there was what I had to do after. Sitting across from Carla at my kitchen table, watching her reach for her tea, knowing everything I knew, keeping my face calm. Asking the right questions in the right order, not because I'm a particularly brave man, but because I'd spent 31 years learning that the most important thing you can do in any difficult situation is stay clear-headed, long enough to think. Panic hands over control. Clarity keeps it. I taught that to teenagers for 3 decades, without fully understanding how much I'd need it myself. The intelligence it took wasn't brilliant or special. It was the ordinary kind. Pay attention, document everything, ask one more question than feels comfortable. Don't let someone else's confidence substitute for your own judgment. Stuart Holt had a warm handshake and a binder and an office on Elm Street, and none of that meant anything except that he'd learned how to look trustworthy. Looking trustworthy and being trustworthy are 2 entirely different things, and the only way to tell them apart is to keep your eyes open long enough to see the difference. Michael is the part of this that still aches. He trusted his wife the way you're supposed to trust someone you've chosen to build a life with. There was nothing wrong in that. What I want him to understand, what I try to say on those Sunday calls, is that the failure here wasn't his. The people who do this count on decent people behaving decently. They count on trust existing. Without it, they have nothing to exploit. What I know now, at 68, is that the 3 things that carried me through, knowing right from wrong clearly enough to act on it, staying sharp when everything in me wanted to collapse, and simply refusing to stop. Those aren't extraordinary. They're available to anyone willing to insist on them. Walter had them. I found mine when I needed them. Helen, I think, was teaching me both all along. I just didn't know I was taking notes.